On the 22nd of September, an advance party moved 50 miles north to Barry, which 8th Army had captured the day before, but no sooner had the rest of the squadron moved up to Barry than the entire wing was relocated further north to a badly damaged aerodrome at Foggia. Again, the squadron was on the attack, bombing and strafing enemy transport supply lines, tanks, gun positions and troops around the rail centre of Termoli, flying on occasions at only 500 feet. Although 2 Kitty Hawks were shot down during these missions, their pilots managed to either bail out or crash land in German-held territory. With great courage and ingenuity, they evaded the German soldiers pursuing them. The fugitives were helped by friendly Italian farmers, who held a strong dislike for their ex-allies, ever since Italy's new leader, Marshal Badoglio, had declared war on Germany and Japan on the 13th of October 1943. Despite heavy rains during October, armed reconnaissance of the area between Pescara and Termoli continued, involving many attacks on rail and motor transports until on the 24th of October, orders were changed, and the squadron began the first of a series of anti-shipping operations over the Adriatic Sea, using long-range fuel tanks fitted onto the Kitty Hawks. Shipping around the Lagosta Islands and German fortifications in Yugoslavia were common targets set by the Desert Air Force controllers. The next airfield to be occupied by the squadron, together with the rest of 239 Wing, was at Malini, where they had to live under canvas in intensely cold weather with frequent rain. It made living difficult and flying even more difficult, but still a dozen or more sorties a day were made, some against German shipping in Yugoslavian harbours. By mid-November, winter gales had slowed most operational activity. Towards the end of November, the 8th Army overcame strong German resistance and crossed the Sangro River to establish a bridgehead. Wet weather rendered airfields unserviceable and generally hindered air activity. The Allies' plan was to liberate Rome as quickly as possible, but the strongly defended Winter Line that the Germans had established right across the Italian peninsula south of Rome temporarily stopped 8th Army. Violent weather and another enemy defense line, known as the Gustav Line, slowed down the US 5th Army trying to get to Rome to join up with 8th Army. 3 squadrons spent December dive bombing and strafing enemy fortifications and carrying out raids across the sea on German targets in Yugoslavia. In January of 1944, 239 Wing leader, South African Lieutenant Colonel Wilmot, had test flown a Kitty Hawk carrying 2 500-pound bombs under its wings, plus a 1,000-pound bomb under the fuselage, equaling the bomb load of a twin-engine Boston bomber. 3 Squadron began bombing with 1,000-pounders. Flight Lieutenant Jack Doyle would drop 3 Squadron's first 1,000-pounder, and his direct hit was the first of many scored by the squadron with these bombs.
The boys liked the idea of being dive bombers. They'd go and dive bomb transport or whatever, and then they could use themselves as fighters. So they could do 2 jobs with the one plane. And then later on we said, well, gee whiz, if they can carry one, perhaps they can carry 2. So we set it up that we could put 2 50-pounders side by side. And then after a while, American bombs started turning up. Must have been under some system that they started, these American bombs started to show up. They were a different shape sort of bomb. They were carting 500-pounders then. And then there was 3 40-pounders under each wing. So we finished up with 6 cannons, 3 40-pounders under each wing, so it's 6 40-pounders and a 500-pound bomb underneath. The same planes, when they went across to Whitley, I think they put a better motor in them, a bit heavier motor, and they were carrying a 500-pounder under each wing and a 1,000-pounder in the guts. I never reckoned they could ever lift off the ground, but they did. And so they were a good, solid aircraft, the Kitty Hawk.
As January 1944 ended, the squadron was bombing targets closer to Rome as part of a new Allied offensive to break through at Cassino. February saw the squadron resume long-range bombing runs over the Adriatic to Split Harbour in Yugoslavia, and attacking and sinking enemy vessels along the way.
We were briefed, as usual, down the operations tent, well, I call it a tent, and we were told that ships had been reported. They didn't give us a description, but they thought one might be a Seabull ferry, which was obviously a carrier ship, probably not only for men but material, and the other was not identified. And we were sent off, a formation of 12, a full squadron this time. I was leading the red section, and Barry Finch was leading the top section. And as we approached the harbour of Fiume, we saw, first of all, the Seabull ferry right in the harbour, not tied up, and also what appeared to be a naval vessel, which I called a corvette. I don't know what it actually was. I reported it as a corvette. And we went down and we clobbered both of them. And that was short and sweet. The damage was quite clear, and there was no question of fudging on this one. So we went back and reported our success, and we were pretty pleased about that.
Chaz was going to lead a formation of 12 across to have a look over a place called Fiume Harbour. I was going to lead top cover. Top cover is like another 6 above the other formation, up sun, so if any aircraft attack us, top cover is the one that engages it first and protects the fellows in the bottom section from their bombs, from losing their bombs. So we took off with 12 Kitty Hawks, with Chaz leading in the front, and finally we got over to Fiume. The briefing was quite full. We knew exactly what we were going to look for, but we didn't have any definite target as to any specific ship or something like that. That was left to us. And when Chaz got over there, they started to throw up a hell of a lot of anti-aircraft, heavy aircraft, the 88. That's the black stuff. And it was quite exciting for a while. Chaz said he could see a small ship down there, which was one of the coastal ships that looks after the coast of Yugoslavia. And the reason we were concerned about it was that Germans had sent a lot of troops down to southern Yugoslavia in the event of a landing in that part of the world. If they had, they'd need to have some sort of defence down there. But now the landing had taken place in Normandy. He wanted to bring his troops out. And there's only about 3 roads he could get them out. And one was to bring them through Fiume and either go on another straight inland from there up into Vienna, or he could take them by water from Fiume up to northern Adriatic somewhere. And so Chaz took his 6 down, and they really knocked this thing over that he could see floating around there. It was just underway, and it was just leaving the harbour. And it sank, and they struggled ashore and got the ship more or less beached, but it was all burnt out and bombed out. So it was very successful, that part of it. Then he told me, well, Blue Leader, you take your lot in and see what you can find. He said, I think there's something else down there that you might want to look at. And I found a corvette, a German corvette, just heading off up the coast. So we went after it. And we got 3 bombs on direct hit, and the rest were all very, very near misses. And the thing just disappeared from blue. It just went. 1 minute it was there, next minute it was under the water, just filled and went. Just incredible. Down she went like a packet of crackers. And so I took all the fellas back and rejoined the formation with Chas. Then he said, would you like to do a recce and see if is the other one still going, or is it all okay? Are you quite sure about it? And I said, I'm pretty sure about it. I think we got them both. But he said, I'll go back and have a look if you'd like to hang around. He said, oh, we'll wait. And so I decided to do the check alone. I went back over the town. Of course, this time all the anti-aircraft was firing at me. Not just 6 aircraft, but 1. Or not 12, but 1. And it wasn't very pleasant at all. So I thought, well, I'll do a quick trip down at low level. I could see what I wanted to see already, really. And I'll see if I can, sharpen a few up with a bit of a strafe as I go down the hill, because there's a great big hill up behind Fiume. And so that's what I did. And so we were credited with the 2 ships, one corvette and 1 Seagull. And we had another one in the Mustangs. A similar sort of a trip, only went right over the other side, well past Fiume, out into the sort of central Yugoslavia. And I was leading on this occasion, and we found 2 locomotives, which were chugging away, pulling great trains behind them. One was a troop train. We got the lot. Really knocked it off the line and blew the locomotive up with the strafing. And the other one, we got him too. He was a goods train, full of German gear, and we got him.
Multiple attempts had been made to capture Cassino, and on the 12th of May, 3 squadrons Kitty Hawks carried 2,000-pound bomb loads and made several attacks on enemy gun emplacements in the area and on long-range gun emplacements in Atina. Eventually, on the 18th of May, the German stronghold monastery at Cassino was captured by the Allies in a tremendous battle against crack German paratroopers who had fought tenaciously to hold this strategically important gateway to Rome. After 5 months at Cutella, on the 24th of May, the squadron were on their way to a new base at San Angelo. Along the way, bombing the Roccagroga area, Warrant Officer Jennings went down. Surviving behind enemy lines, Jennings was disguised by some Italian locals, and he spent 5 long days avoiding Germans and walked back to the Allied front line.
This was obviously an interesting situation. We were busy watching Rome, and it was getting to the point where it was about to be entered by the Americans and the New Zealanders, who were pushing like hell up the line. In fact, on my first operational flight, they announced they'd taken Monte Cassino Abbey. It had been holding up things for a long time. And so once they lost that, the troops were able to push straight through on the old highway, right all the way through to Rome, with a little bit of restraint, of course, from the Germans, who stopped them as long as they could. Anyway, 3 of our senior pilots took off in a 3-tonner, went over to where the troops were. So they went in with the troops on the first day into Rome. Meanwhile, I was back on flying again, of course, and busy doing these close support operations with the Kitty Hawk, all the Kitty Hawk fellas. Hard as, close as often as 2 and 3 times a day. And I did a lot of flying in those few weeks. It was a good place to be.
On the 25th of May, the enemy began to evacuate Rome under the onslaught of the combined forces of the 5th and 8th Armies. 3 Squadron flew constant sorties for the next week against the retreating enemy on the roads around Rome, and they had a field day on the 30th when they found 200 transports jammed nose to tail and 3 wide on a road south of Subiaco. The end result, after other squadrons from the wing joined them, was a long charred column of wrecks.
Once that line was broken, the Germans retreated to a next defensive line, and that meant movement by road. They had no naval force down there at all, and they had virtually no air force by that time. So those narrow mountain roads were just clogged with traffic. And we would sometimes fly 3 operations a day per pilot. So that left little time for anything else. 2 flights a day, 2 operations a day for each pilot was quite common. It was high summer, the days were long, and the targets were plentiful. And it wasn't just a matter of having targets, but it was a matter of the strategy of the army to interdict this movement as much as possible and to inflict as much damage on men and material as they possibly could before they took up their next defensive position. So the roads were clogged, and during the daytime, some of the aerial photographs that one can still see just showed these long lines of vehicles, some of them HDVs, horse-drawn vehicles, which we used to claim. That might be more shocking to you than claiming a human target. But they used anything they could to get out and set up this defensive line. Whenever this situation subsisted, cutting narrow mountain roads, cutting bridges, cutting railways, hitting at strong points and armoured points in support of the army, occurred mainly in the early and midsummer. If any bad weather intervened, we might be sent off to Yugoslavia, mainly to the coast, to interfere with marine traffic up and down the coast of Yugoslavia. That was a favourite form of transport for the Germans because there were no partisans out there on the water. They were hiding in the woods and valleys and mountains of the mainland, or the hinterland, I should say. So the Germans tried to move things, a lot of things, by boat. We would be sent over to knock those out if we could when we weren't, when it was considered to be a target which had priority over these other targets that I've been describing. And it was only bad weather where we really had such low cloud that we couldn't get at a target without extreme danger to hitting hills that were not clearly were not visible at all.
During the 4th and 5th of June, the Allies marched into Rome, and a week later, the squadron moved to Guidonia, which was little more than an hour's drive northeast of Rome. During the next 10 days, many of the men in the squadron took the opportunity of visiting this famous city, but, during the same time, they still flew 48 sorties against enemy transports and gun positions. Then, on the 23rd of June, the wing moved again, this time to Falerium. Day after day, the wing provided air support for the ground troops as they advanced northward, chasing a retreating German army. The pace stepped up, and on some days, the squadron flew 36 sorties as far north as Florence and Rimini. The squadron continued to move up close behind the line to provide constant bombing and strafing sorties at the retreating enemy. By the 15th of July, the enemy had retreated north past Arezzo, but they didn't retreat from Florence, and it took almost another month before Florence could be liberated. During that month, the squadron continued to provide air support for the attacking 8th Army and still managed to carry out many shipping and rail strikes.
I hated the flying around the Arezzo bit, which was very vicious and very dirty bit. The weather was fine and clear. Arezzo was controlling a major access road to Florence. And the flying was, the actions were very bitter. They were bringing in artillery and just not without time to camouflage it or conceal it. And we were going down to knock it out as soon as we could. It was a bit like sitting here and you could see the aeroplanes over there going down in the bomb dive. And that's how close we really were. You could do a trip over in 10 minutes and back again in another 5 or 10 or thereabouts. And the results were always close support work, heavy ack-ack. And at night, in the last one of the day, was the worst, because by that time you'd done 3 or 4. And instead of just seeing the puffs of smoke or the explosions of the anti-aircraft fire, you're seeing the explosions in colour, technicolour, and you're getting the traces and all the bright lights. It was like Sydney Harbour on Boxing Day or Christmas night, or New Year's Eve. It was the colour, all the colours made it even worse, and I didn't like it much, but it didn't matter. We lost 2 or 3 blokes around here, and it was a very sad time for us, really.
By this time the Luftwaffe was rarely seen. However, the German anti-aircraft gun crews were dangerously accurate against the attacking Kitty Hawks. 3 Squadron was the first RAAF unit to be equipped with North American P-51 Mustang IIIs, and between the 13th and the 15th of November, they received 5 of these new fighter bombers. A few days later, operations were suspended while pilots and ground staff trained on their new aircraft, and before long, most were saying that the Mustang was quite an improvement on the faithful old Kitty Hawk.
We were told towards the end of my tour, probably in November, that we were going to be converted to Mustangs. And that was a great morale booster. They were very fine aircraft, streets ahead of the Kitty Hawk, steady in a bomb dive, faster, more manoeuvrable, and really nice to fly, very well behaved. So the day arrived when a few Mustangs turned up at the strip, and in turn we were shown the cockpit and any differences that we might not have been familiar with from the Kitty, and told to take her off because he didn't have 2 seats, he only had the 1 seat, and go up and do a few aerobatics and get used to the feel of it, and come back so the next chap could have a ride. We did that for a few days.
It was just so much faster. And it had a supercharger which at 14,000 feet or thereabouts would come in as though a giant hand had grabbed the aircraft and thrown it like a dart. It was just an extraordinary feeling of power. The power was, you'd open the throttle and you'd get 52 inches of boost pressure, which was enormous compared to what a Kitty Hawk could have. And this big prop would go around and hooly-dooly, it would just rocket you down the runway. They would land, come in over the fence to land at 120 miles an hour, but came to a Kitty Hawk, which was around about 80. So it was a lot faster coming in to land. And that took a bit of getting used to for a little while. But apart from that, it was just the most superb aircraft you could ever imagine.
The pilots found that Mustang's steady, smooth diving capability gave them more accurate bombing results, and its speed, rate of climb and range were far better than their former Kitty Hawks. It could fly at 430 miles per hour at 30,000 feet and reach that height in about 12.5 minutes. With a long-range fuel tank attached, it could fly for 5 to 7 hours and cover almost 2,500 miles. It could carry 2 1,000-pound bombs or a single bomb, plus the long-range fuel tank, which could be dropped before the start of a bombing dive. The Mustang had only 4 0.5-inch caliber machine guns and carried 250 rounds of ammunition. Less than the Kitty Hawk, but still provided adequate firepower. The squadron's last Kitty Hawk operational flight, comprising 12 aircraft, took off from their new landing ground at Fano on the 20th of November 1944. After completing an attack on gun targets in the Faenza area, they were handed over to the maintenance unit for transfer to other squadrons as required. Then, on the 22nd, the squadron's first operational flight of 6 Mustangs escorted a Lysander on a special mission over northern Italy. Incredibly, during the journey, a 12th US Air Force Mustang mistook the slow-flying Lysander for an enemy and shot it down before the squadron escort could do anything to prevent it. But subsequently, the squadron's 6 pilots were cleared of any blame whatsoever.
I think probably the first operation that I went on was that one in which the 2 agents were shot down in the Lysander. We were in Mustangs, remember, which were far speedier than the Lysander, so we were just doing this, weaving around the Lysander because it was so slow, and we had to weave in order to keep back with it. And the American formation was over here at, say, 10 o'clock, and they just flew around for a while, and then suddenly one of them obviously took it into his head to shoot down this aeroplane which he had wrongly identified as a German aeroplane. It had the RAAF rondels on it and was quite different, was noticeably different from the similar German aircraft, but obviously his aircraft recognition skills were lacking. And he thought he'd shot down an enemy aircraft.
Early in December, it was so cold and wet that the squadron was stood down from operations for several days. When flying did resume, the weather was unpredictable. On the 6th, complete cloud cover closed in on a flight of 3 squadron Mustangs returning from a strafing run over Yugoslavia, and one flown by Warrant Officer R.E.R. Fountain disappeared without trace. Another 6 of the 10 aircraft from South African 5 Squadron also disappeared in heavy cloud that day. Perhaps if the very experienced Flight Lieutenant Ian Rodiger hadn't been leading the 3 squadron flight, the squadron's losses could have been much worse that day. Since mid-September, 3 other pilots had been killed, 2 going down after being hit by anti-aircraft fire, and the 3rd never returned from a solo strafing run. Christmas 1944 was the 5th Christmas that the squadron had spent overseas. By then the Allied armies had the upper hand, but German resistance was still very strong throughout Europe. By the end of 1944, 4 Tu-39 wing squadrons had been equipped with Mustangs, but few of the Mustangs had engaged enemy aircraft, as these were now rarely seen in northern Italy. However, on Boxing Day, Warrant Officer Quinn of 3 Squadron was jumped out of the sun by 2 Italian fascist Bf-109s. Quinn was shot down before he could retaliate, but he bailed out successfully. Later, having jettisoned their bombs, Commanding Officer Murray Nash and his flight of Mustangs stalked and ambushed one of the enemy aircraft, successfully shooting it down. 3 Squadron received orders to begin dropping napalm bombs at the beginning of 1945, and their first target was an enemy pocket near Alfonsine. 6 Mustangs went in first, and each dropped their 2 500-pound bombs into the target area. Then the other 6 Mustangs, armed with napalm bombs, followed in long, shallow dives at a height of about 100 feet and dropped their loads. The results were devastating. The squadron did a few weeks in February of blind bombing from 12,000 feet. Bad weather in March made it difficult to target anything, and by the beginning of April, the final offensive by the 8th Army began with 3 Squadron and the rest of the wing flying almost continuous formations of Mustangs in flights of 4, 5 and 6 aircraft to bomb and strafe the enemy positions for much of that month. On the 5th of May, the squadron completed its last operational flight, carrying out a reconnaissance of the areas around Fiume, Trieste and Udine. Warrant Officer Arthur Pardee was one of the pilots who flew that last sortie. 2 weeks later, 3 Squadron moved to Laveriano, where they finally began to relax for the first time in years, although many in the squadron confessed to a strong feeling of anticlimax and even depression with the realization that the war against Japan still had to be won. Squadron leader Murray Nash continued to lead the squadron during its winding down period, which involved final moves on the 20th of August to Taranto and back to Al Mazrah, Cairo on the 13th of September in preparation for its return to Australia. By the 15th of December 1945, the squadron was back at Point Cook, and Flight Lieutenant A.J. Holter took temporary command on the 16th, until Flying Officer W.M. Campbell relieved him on the 11th of March 1946. But by then, the RAAF command had decided to disband the squadron, so, for the next 3 months, only a skeleton structure of 3 squadron existed to carry out the necessary administration work. On the 30th of July 1946, the squadron was officially disbanded. 3 squadrons' record of 25,663 operational flight hours and 192.5 enemy aircraft destroyed, 63 probable, and 141 damaged, made it the highest-scoring RAAF fighter squadron. The squadron had also destroyed a further 29 aircraft on the ground, 709 motor vehicles, 12 locomotives, and 325 rail cars were claimed. The squadron also scored 73 direct dive bombing hits on bridges and more than 800 other ground targets, including roads, railways, buildings, such as pinpoint raids on German headquarters, and enemy artillery. One large dam was busted to prevent the Germans using its water as a weapon. In strikes over the sea, 54 vessels of varying sizes were sunk, including 10 ships of more than 1,000 tons each. The squadron had lost 78 personnel during their deployment. They will not be forgotten.
Thanks for watching this final part in our series on 3 Squadron in World War II.